I think we're able to move on to our California story.
Yeah, definitely. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, a particular candidate for this upcoming presidential election. Now, this candidate isn't somebody that has actually started their campaign, but has definitely made movements and, said that they're going to do it recently, and it's nobody other than the current governor of California, Gavin Newsom. So, the question about whether he's going to be running for president under the 2028, Democratic Party ticket has come forward again a lot more recently, especially within the past year. But I also feel like within the past couple weeks, there's been a lot of lack of discourse online. I want to call it discourse, but obviously when people are just posting online about stuff, it's not really people talking about things. Um, and so even though he hasn't started an official campaign yet, we saw midway through last year it was clear he was changing his position on, potentially running, and he's also changing his messaging and reach to some capacity. One of the things that was most noteworthy is a year ago, he started up a podcast where he pretty much exclusively hosts conversations that pander to far right figures such as Steve Bannon, Ben Shapiro. I think like the first person he had on his podcast was the now late Charlie Kirk. And he's at the same time, last summer was trying to act like he's some sort of like resistance leader against Trump. Like when he deployed the National Guard to LA against Newsom's wishes. So, despite these attempts to reach to a broader base, I feel like this has generally been met with ire from people on both sides of the aisle, given that Newsom's tendency to produce extremely cringeworthy moments. One thing that came up recently was he made some pretty disparaging comments against Black people in a talk with the mayor of Atlanta, Andre Diggins, where Newsom stated, "I'm just trying to impress upon you. I'm like you. I'm no better than you. I'm a 960 SAT guy." Really, and after the fact he was like, "Well, you don't get it, like I've really struggled with dyslexia and all this sort of stuff." And it's like, yeah, but you grew up rich. Like, you're a white dude from California, you're a corporate Democrat. I feel like in a lot of ways he is like the poster child of corporate Democrat. When I think about that term, which I feel like is kind of a loaded term, he's the face that comes up for me, and that's kind of who he's been his whole career. um, I also think about, like, in particular, his inability to hold ground on important issues, like when he flip flopped on calling ICE to quote unquote state sponsored terrorism on his X account and then backed down from it recently when Shapiro disagreed with him on his podcast. I think that's really telling. I think that's really typical in a lot of ways that a lot of these like diehard liberals act. It's like, oh, we can like disagree on like certain points, and ultimately, if I say something too strong, I'll end up coming around and being like, oh, actually, you're right. And I really want to underline the fact that it probably wasn't him that posted this on his Twitter. It was likely an intern or somebody from his staff that felt like it would have made for a good viral tweet moment. But at the same time, these aren't actually positions that he strongly holds. And it's clear in the fact that he really backs down from this stuff when he's really like confronted on these stronger stances that are quite popular in a lot of respects. I think a lot of people see what's happening with ICE in particular and are like, yeah, like this is state sponsored terrorism. This stuff is really horrible. Like this does need to come to an end. We need to actually get rid of ICE. We need to abolish ICE instead of like, oh, we just need to give them body cams and like the same training, even though realistically, like body cams don't work, training doesn't work. A lot of these people are trained. They just don't have to be held to the same standard. Not that that makes a difference in the long term, but I think it's there's a lot of misinformation about this stuff in general. Um, so, on one hand, it does seem like there's a lot of people who don't take this guy seriously. But I think I realized a couple weeks ago that he does have some sort of base of support. And his base of support is likely a lot of like diehard Democrats who fall into the quote unquote vote blue no matter who category. And a lot of these people started being really vocal online about how he is the candidate for us, a couple weeks ago when Newsom started his book tour, I think in like February or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
People from this camp in general, I feel like take this hypocritical stance that it's the quote unquote left that is not capable of winning anything. They're not a sizable force. But at the same time, they're saying that they're wreckers and that, progressives are directly responsible for losing the last few elections for the Dems, despite the fact that if we look at the numbers, like we just look at the data, it's very clear that even if you took all of the third party voters, it would not make up the difference between Trump and Kamala. If you took all the people who didn't vote and put them into the Democratic Party vote, that would have made a difference. But at the same time, a lot of these people are more interested in pandering to the right, pandering to the status quo, than actually, following through with this idea of like, um, you know, dinner table policies, dinner table politics, or whatever the term is. Things that people actually care about and actually doing them. Um, and so I think like most of these folks are also putting forward the position that unless progressives can actually put forward a better candidate, they cannot criticize the current candidate, even though realistically he hasn't even started his election campaign and no decision has been made within the party that he is their guy. So I find it, quite fascinating in some ways that, a lot of these people who are supposedly the loudest about democracy are putting forward an extremely anti-democratic line when there's still over 2.5 years out before, this upcoming presidential election, which is at the end of 2028. It's the beginning of 2026. And I think this is a pretty small minority compared to where most people are at, but this camp is still particularly loud and obnoxious. And I think it really underlines the fact that, there's this term, blue MAGA, that we've used before. And I think these folks are blue MAGA, or they're at least adjacent to it. So I don't know. I'd be curious to hear, what your thoughts are, Dayton. If Newsom were to actually start a campaign, would he get on the ticket? Does he have a chance against someone like Vance? Is he actually capable of moving left, being held accountable, putting forth an actually progressive policy? Or are his corporate roots ultimately indicative of his deeper positions in the reality that he is sort of like the poster child of quote unquote corporate Democrats?
Yeah, I think he's like the last face that the corporate Dems really have,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the
Yeah.
staunchly corporate Dems. He's like worked to like build this sort of national image as opposed to his his statewide or local image of being like a center left reasonable progressive guy, right? Like I can think of like 2011 or let's say like 2014 when he was lieutenant governor, right? He like had a who was known for making his stances against tuition hikes, right? So he like had some sense of being in adjacent to some of these youth movements at that time,
Mm-hmm.
as well as progressive stances on things like marijuana legalization and closing tax loopholes.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, his record is of complete corporatization, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
think of even just when he was a San Francisco mayor, closing up different welfare the systems, right? Um, I can't remember what did he call it when he ended welfare in San Francisco. It had a really patronizing name. What was it? Instead of without it was like limiting handouts was basically his reasoning in the SF mayor, right? The idea that we need to give people resources, or rather give people different opportunities outside of direct aid, and then he takes his money and redirects it into the general fund of San Francisco, and then he gets gobbled up by these other corporate interests. And
Pretty typical.
it's the basic. That's his basic pattern, moving up to higher and higher office. Is the idea that he's standing for these so-called liberal progressive values, but at the end of the day, he's creating these boons for these major corporations, these major real estate corporations, and also you see just the real political opportunism that even these so-called minority groups that he claims to stump for, he's willing to throw them under the bus to sort of widen his appeal amongst the general audience. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this just goes back to kind of like the subjectivity of the ruling class. That the ruling class really kind of, as they get more up in their ivory towers, they really struggle to see where the meter is, because you have to be really fucking stupid to think that Charlie Kirk is going to like build your voter base, right? Like I think that's just also important, right? Because Charlie Kirk is not a grassroots figure. Like he's not. Like he's literally an astroturf Trump plant, right? He was put, he's Koch brothers money, like his father was like some Trump asset, right? And so this guy was put in place to sort of create the image that young people were tired of leftism and wanted to like convert to evangelicalism and stop having premarital sex. It's ridiculous. Right. And he just has some base on the internet. You can see all these people that making memes about Charlie Kirk. We are Charlie Kirk, the AI slop that's coming out. Right. And so, you really see how he tried to align himself sort of tangentially with the fringes of this like MAGA movement on this idea is like, well, maybe I can peel off some of these MAGA people into my new coalition versus actually running on grassroots campaigns, grassroots issues to sort of bring people that are disenfranchised back into the electoral system, right? That's a real opportunity. And I think these
Mm-hmm.
social democratic people, like let's go back to people like Mamdani, that's basically what they run on, right? Their idea is that they're going to, still essentially be, mainstream Democrats. Mamdani is a mainstream Democrat. I'm sorry, everybody. He's a De Blasio liberal. It's okay. It's okay. But he's running on relevant, popular, in some cases, populist issues, or run on, and he promotes, I should say. He's already won his office, and
Mm-hmm.
he's brought all kinds of young people back into the liberal capitalist establishment, right? And then we see, you see, like for the majority of the Democrats, the majority of this political establishment, that's like basically cancer to them. They would rather placate Nick Fuentes, Charlie Kirk, and any of these other sort of peripheral Trump figures to try to make themselves seem more amenable. And so, but I also hear a lot about some of these different sort of there's a lot of liberals that love Gavin Newsom, and I think we really have to put that
Mm-hmm.
in context of, again, like a basic class orientation, right? Like he represents like a sanitized corporate respectable image that the Democratic base is just so confident in. They're just so confident in that because they really think that's the way to go, and that's their strategy, but not recognizing that the majority of this electorate is not interested in another slick corporatist who has
Mm-hmm.
no record of actually fixing the things that he claims he's going to fix. Right? Like, if you're like a middle class person with some kind of, or even let's be frank, like if you're an upper middle class person with some interest in tech or real estate, you probably fucking love Gavin Newsom. You probably think Gavin Newsom's like the best fucking thing. But the rest of us, like, we don't trust this guy. Why would we trust this guy?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just important that we see him as a clown. Um, and that until like any of these establishment parties put forward candidates that actually either have a record of addressing their constituents or actually are serious about going against this basic corporatism, they're not going to get young people to vote for them unless they take firm stances against international issues. Like, these new young people are not going to vote for them. And so, and then it's going to create this loop where you're going to have more conservatives winning because you have so many of these corporate Dems pissing people off and convincing minorities and young people not to vote. They were going to continue this, and then that's going to be blamed on the masses, sort of like sort of like with Kamala Harris's campaign, or more recently in Texas with Jasmine Crockett's campaign. This idea that like, oh, people don't want black women running for office. Like, no, they don't want corporatists that are pro-Zionist running for office. They don't like that. Like, none of these demographics that the Democrats have courted for the last 30, 40, 50 years want any of that bullshit. They are sick of corporatists. They're sick of people that fund foreign wars and fund foreign governments. It doesn't matter if they're the right race. Or the right gender identity. That's not actually going to, these real issues are what's going to convince them. And so, yeah, I don't know. Like, he's an early entry into this race. He hasn't officially entered, but he's probably going to get knocked out, like closer to the middle, and he might end up getting like if there is a Democratic nominee that ultimately wins, he might, he might get a cabinet position or some shit.
Yeah. I can't say this enough. I hate Gavin Newsom. The dude is like literally embodies everything that I don't like about a politician. It doesn't matter that he's done some like progressive things over the years. I think ultimately, like, his inability to follow through even with the most basic stuff that people have wanted for decades, really just underlines like who he really is and who he really represents. I think the one thing I always bring up is the high speed rail, and I think it was like over a decade ago at this point that as a state, California voted to create this high speed rail. And what was the first thing that he did when he came into office? He vetoed it, you know. And now there's like they're doing some construction, and they have this first stage of this rail being done, and that's like, I don't know, like 10-15 years after he initially got into office. And where this rail is supposed to go from? Fucking Merced to Bakersfield. How useless is that? Like, I know things that have to happen in stages, but like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you got to think about the huge metropolitan areas of Merced and Bakersfield, people. All right. Like, it's just, and I know like this is just like one thing, but it just like really shows just like how incapable someone like him is with doing like really basic shit that could like revolutionize just like one of the largest economies in the world. We could very easily have a high-speed rail from Sacramento all the way to Los Angeles already, and that would change things so drastically for so many people. um and in addition to that, we just see like all the pandering that he's been doing lately, and just like some of the stuff he's saying, it's like it doesn't make any sense. It's like, who is he really speaking to? When he comes out and he's just like, oh yeah, like I'm sick of all this like pronoun talk and whatever. It's like, dude, like you sound like MAGA. Like they do sound like one of these people in that. And like, yeah, like there are probably a lot of people who voted Republican who you can probably peel off, but they're not a part of the MAGA movement. They might have voted for Donald Trump, but they're not in line with these like hardcore extremists who make up, maybe 10% of the population. There's still 90% of the population that you can still bring in. And a lot of those people are people who don't vote. And a lot of those people are people who are left of, these corporate policies and the status quo of the Democratic Party. And they don't buy into this whole idea that the Democratic Party actually represents any sort of meaningful resistance to Trump, because they don't. They're very much in line with a lot of what he's doing. And they might like, hold up their placards and, cry and yell when he's like making a speech, and, like stand in silence, like symbolically, but they don't really do a whole lot else other than that that's meaningful. And they don't actually listen to people on these important issues, and they do what Newsom does. They back down when they're actually confronted with the things that they're putting forward. And that's not something that anybody should ever want in a politician. It's like, I think at the end of the day, it's like, if I were to ever support a politician, I'd rather have somebody who was a jerk but got shit done, and actually stayed true to their principles, even if it got them in a lot of trouble, even if they didn't stick around for a long time. I'd rather they stayed true to their principles. But someone like Newsom, it's like he's just a through and through corporate Democrat. He has no principles other than the money that he makes, the status that he holds. It's like this dude grew up in the Marina District. One of his first businesses was opening like a chain of wine stores. Like,
not even that long ago.
Yeah, it's like,
not even that long
come
ago.
on. Like, do you really think this guy is the right fit for most Americans? Do you think most Americans can relate to this guy? Most Americans are going to see this guy and be like, this is exactly who we don't want. We don't want this like slick corporate Democrat coming from California telling us what to think and do. Because that's what a lot of people see in the Democratic Party. That's what a lot of people see in a lot of these other things, whether when they go in other directions, whether they might be misguided or not, And I think ultimately it's a huge mistake that people are making when they think that like, like this is who we got to go with, or this is the best we can do. And ultimately it's not on, progressives to put somebody forth somebody better. It's on the people who actually want to win over a base of support to actually see them for what they really are and do something about it, and recognize that like, hey, like if this guy is not somebody that a lot of people want, why are we backing him? Why do we back what he says? Why do we stand for him? Because he's not going to be the one that's going to get shit done for people. And yeah, I really hope he just tanks us super fast, because I'm sick of this guy. I don't want to see him ever again, but he's our governor. So
yeah, you're gonna see him for a while.
Yeah.
Watch after he starts. After he becomes a private citizen and just becomes like gets his own tequila brand.
Yeah.
and just goes full hard into being a podcaster, and then he's just in the third, and then he'll just join the third Trump administration.
At least it'll only be like 25% rum instead of fucking 50% rum like fucking Casamigos.
Yuck. Yuck.